Captain Selan Varis stood alone in the center of the galactic tribunal's vast chamber, the weight of 1,000 worlds pressing down on him. The room was filled with representatives from every corner of the galaxy, their eyes fixed on the human who had brought both terror and salvation to the stars. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow sound. Varis was no stranger to the horrors of war. He had led his people through the darkest days of the Krell invasion, a time when humanity had teetered on the brink of annihilation. The Krell, a merciless and advanced species, had swept through human space, their war fleets leaving nothing but death and destruction in their wake. Planet after planet had fallen, their inhabitants slaughtered or enslaved. The galaxy had watched, indifferent or powerless, as humanity fought for its very survival. But Varis had not given up. He had rallied what was left of the human fleet, striking back with a ferocity that surprised even the most battle-hardened of the Krell. Yet, as the war dragged on, it became clear that conventional tactics would not be enough. Humanity was outmatched in every way, their technology inferior, their numbers dwindling. Desperation led to the creation of Project Ragnarok, a weapon of last resort, one that would change the course of the war and the fate of humanity forever. Now, in the aftermath of that war, Varis stood accused of crimes that defied imagination. The destruction of the Krell homeworld had been absolute, billions of lives snuffed out in an instant. The tribunal's lead adjudicator, a towering insectoid from the Jar Empire, finally spoke, his voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. Captain Selan Varis, you stand accused of war crimes of the highest order. The annihilation of an entire species, the use of forbidden weapons, the violation of every known law of war. How do you plead? The question hung in the air, the silence stretching on as every eye in the chamber focused on Varis. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost cold, and it carried a weight that seemed to shake the very foundation of the tribunal. Guilty, Varis said, his eyes hard as he scanned the room. And I would do it all again. The shockwave of his words rippled through the chamber, a collective gasp echoing from the assembled representatives. This was not the plea of a man seeking mercy or understanding. This was a declaration, a defiance in the face of the galaxy's judgment. Varis continued, his voice steady, unwavering. The Krell were a threat to all life, not just to humanity. They would have consumed us, just as they consumed countless other species before us. My actions, terrible as they were the only way to stop them. He paused, letting his words sink in, watching the reactions of those who would decide his fate. Some looked at him with horror, others with a grudging respect, but none could deny the truth of what he had said. The Krell had been an existential threat, and Varis had done what he believed was necessary to save not just his own people, but the galaxy itself. As the tribunal deliberated, Varis stood alone, unrepentant. He knew that whatever the outcome, history would remember him not as a hero or a villain, but as the man who made the hardest choice of all to sacrifice his soul to save the future. The Krell invasion began without warning, a tidal wave of destruction that swept through human space like a wildfire. The Krell were relentless, their technology far surpassing anything humanity could muster. Their ships, sleek and deadly, cut through human defenses with ease, leaving nothing but death and desolation in their wake. Entire colonies were wiped out, their populations eradicated or enslaved to serve the Krell war machine. Humanity was on the brink of extinction, their desperate cries for help echoing through the galaxy, unanswered. The other species watched from afar, and willing to risk their own safety for a species they barely knew. To them, humanity was a young and insignificant race, one that would soon be snuffed out by the might of the Krell. But humanity did not go quietly. In their darkest hour, they rallied what remained of their forces, determined to fight to the last breath. The United Earth fleet, once proud and mighty, was now a shadow of its former self, a ragtag assembly of ships held together by little more than determination and desperation. Captain Selan Varis was at the forefront of this struggle. A seasoned officer with a reputation for unconventional tactics, Varis knew that traditional warfare would lead to certain defeat. The Krell were too powerful, too advanced. Humanity needed a weapon that could turn the tide, something that would strike fear into the heart of their enemy. That weapon was Project Ragnarok. Project Ragnarok was humanity's last desperate gamble. Developed in secret, it was a weapon of unimaginable power, capable of turning a planet's core into a raging inferno, consuming everything in its path. It was a weapon of mass destruction, one that defied every law of war, every moral code. But in the face of annihilation, such considerations were set aside. Varis was given command of the project, a burden he accepted with grim resolve. He knew what the weapon was capable of, the devastation it would unleash. But he also knew that it was the only way to stop the Krell. The decision weighed heavily on him, the knowledge that he would be responsible for the deaths of billions. But as he watched world after world fall to the Krell, the screams of the dying ringing in his ears, he steeled himself for what had to be done. The day came when the Krell fleet surrounded the last bastion of human resistance. They were poised for a final assault, one that would wipe humanity from the galaxy forever. It was then that Varis gave the order. With a single command, Project Ragnarok was activated, its power unleashed upon the Krell homeworld. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The planet's core ignited, a firestorm of unimaginable proportions consuming the world in seconds. The Krell fleets still in orbit were caught in the blast, their ships torn apart by the fury of the explosion. In one fell swoop, the Krell Empire was shattered, their homeworld reduced to a charred husk, their species brought to the brink of extinction. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The galaxy, once indifferent to humanity's plight, now looked upon them with fear and horror. They had unleashed a weapon that defied comprehension, a weapon that had wiped out billions of lives in an instant. Humanity had survived, but at what price? As the dust settled and the Krell remnants scattered, Varis returned to Earth, not as a hero, but as a man haunted by the ghosts of the billions he had condemned to death. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, a burden he knew he would carry for the rest of his life. But he also knew that there had been no other choice. Humanity had been pushed to the brink, and in their desperation, they had done what had to be done. The Krell were gone, but the memory of their destruction would linger, a dark stain on humanity's soul. The destruction of the Krell homeworld sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. The moment Project Ragnarok was unleashed, the Krell Empire, once feared and powerful, was reduced to ashes. Their fleets, which had once blazed a trail of destruction through human space, were now nothing more than drifting wreckage in the cold void. The Krell themselves, a species that had terrorized countless civilizations, were now on the verge of extinction. But with their fall came the dawn of a new, uncertain era for humanity. When the news of the Krell's destruction reached Earth, there were mixed reactions. Some celebrated Captain Selan Varis as a hero, the man who had saved humanity from certain doom. Others, however, saw him as a monster, a man who had committed an unforgivable atrocity in the name of survival. The moral lines were blurred, and the weight of what had been done hung heavy in the air. Varis returned to Earth, but there was no grand welcome awaiting him. He was a man haunted by the enormity of his actions, the images of billions of Krell lives snuffed out in an instant playing over and over in his mind. The once proud captain now carried the burden of a decision that had saved his people, but had also plunged him into a darkness from which he knew he would never fully escape. On Earth, the political and social landscape began to shift. The destruction of the Krell had bought humanity time, but it had also painted them in a new, terrifying light. The galaxy now viewed humans with a mix of fear and suspicion. They were no longer seen as the young, naive species struggling to find its place among the stars. They were now seen as dangerous, unpredictable, and capable of unimaginable destruction. The Galactic Council, which had watched the events unfold with growing concern, quickly convened to discuss the implications of Varis's actions. Humanity, once a peripheral player in galactic politics, was now at the center of a storm. The Council was divided on how to respond. Some argued for immediate sanctions against Earth, fearing what humanity might do next. Others, however, recognized that humanity's actions, while extreme, had been driven by desperation and a will to survive. Varis, meanwhile, was taken into custody by the newly formed Earth Defense Directorate, an organization created in the wake of the Krell War to manage the aftermath and to prepare for any potential future threats. The Directorate's leaders knew that Varis would be a controversial figure, and they moved quickly to distance themselves from his actions, framing them as the decisions of a man pushed to the brink, rather than the official policy of Earth. Despite this, Varis's trial at the Galactic Tribunal was inevitable. He was charged with war crimes, specifically the use of a weapon that had resulted in the genocide of an entire species. The trial was as much about humanity as it was about Varis, with the entire galaxy watching to see how the newly emerging power would be judged. And yet, despite everything, Varis remained resolute in his belief that he had done what was necessary. The Krell had been an existential threat, one that had to be stopped at any cost. The alternative, as far as Varis was concerned, was the extinction of humanity. In the days leading up to the trial, Varis reflected on the path that had brought him to this point. He had once been a soldier, a man who believed in honor and duty. But the war with the Krell had changed everything. It had forced him to confront the darkest parts of himself, to make decisions that would haunt him for the rest of his days. As the day of the trial arrived, Varis stood before the Galactic Tribunal, knowing that his fate, and the fate of humanity, hung in the balance. The galaxy would judge him, but Varis knew that the true judgment would come from within. He had saved his people, but at what cost? The answer to that question would follow him for the rest of his life, no matter what the tribunal decided. The day of the verdict arrived, and the Galactic Tribunal's chamber was filled to capacity. Representatives from every major species in the galaxy were present, eager to witness the outcome of what had become the most significant trial in recent history. Captain Selan Varis stood at the center of the chamber, his expression stoic, as he waited to hear the judgment that would decide his fate. The trial had been grueling, with every detail of the Krell's destruction laid bare for the galaxy to see. The prosecution had painted Varis as a war criminal, a man who had willfully committed genocide, violating the most fundamental principles of sentient life. They had brought forth witness after witness, each recounting the horrors of the Krell's annihilation, the billions of lives lost in an instant. The images of the Krell homeworld, now a barren wasteland, had been displayed in vivid detail, a grim reminder of the consequences of Varis's actions. But Varis's defense had been equally compelling. His legal team had argued that the Krell posed an existential threat to not just humanity, but to the entire galaxy. They had presented evidence of the Krell's ruthless conquests, their enslavement and extermination of countless species. They had shown how the Krell had given humanity no choice but to fight with everything they had, even if it meant resorting to the most extreme measures. Varis himself had taken the stand, speaking with a calm, unwavering resolve. He had admitted to giving the order to deploy Project Ragnarok, but he had made it clear that it was a decision born of necessity, not malice. "The Krell left us with no choice," he had said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "It was either us or them. I chose to save my people, and I would make the same choice again." The tribunal's lead adjudicator, the towering insectoid from the Jar Empire, called the Chamber to order. The entire galaxy seemed to hold its breath as the adjudicator began to speak. Captain Selan Varis, the Galactic Tribunal has carefully considered the evidence presented before us. We recognize the gravity of the situation you faced and the impossible choices you were forced to make. However, we cannot ignore the scale of the destruction you unleashed, nor the precedent it sets for the future. The adjudicator paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. It is the judgment of this tribunal that you, Captain Selan Varis, are guilty of war crimes against sentient life. However, we also recognize that your actions, while extreme, were driven by a desire to protect your species and the galaxy from a threat of unimaginable scale. The chamber was silent as the adjudicator continued. In light of these considerations, this tribunal has decided on a sentence of exile. You will be transported to the Outer Rim, beyond the borders of known space, where you will live out the rest of your days. You will have no further contact with the galaxy, and your name will be stricken from the records of history. Varis felt a strange mix of relief and resignation wash over him. He had expected death, or perhaps imprisonment, but exile was a fate he had not anticipated. It was a punishment that would allow him to live, but it would be a life of solitude, far from everything he had ever known. The adjudicator's voice softened slightly as he delivered the final words. Captain Varis, your actions have forever changed the course of history. The galaxy will remember what you did, and it will serve as a warning to all who would consider the path of total destruction. You will be taken to your new home immediately. May you find peace there. With that, the trial was over. Varis was led away by guards, his face expressionless as the doors of the tribunal closed behind him. The galaxy had passed its judgment, and now he would live out the rest of his life in exile, a man who had saved his people, but lost everything else in the process. Years passed, and Captain Selan Varis faded from the memories of many, his name whispered only in the darkest corners of the galaxy. Exiled to a barren world on the fringes of known space, Varis lived out his days in solitude, far removed from the chaos and destruction that had once defined his existence. The desolate landscape around him mirrored the emptiness he felt inside, a constant reminder of the choices he had made and the lives he had taken. His days were spent in quiet reflection, the echoes of the past never far from his mind. The faces of the Krell, both soldiers and civilians, haunted his dreams, their eyes accusing, their voices silent, but full of the questions that had no easy answers. Had he truly saved humanity, or had he simply condemned it to a future tainted by the blood of an entire species? The weight of his actions was a burden he would carry until his final breath. The galaxy, meanwhile, had moved on, but the shadow of Varis's actions lingered. The destruction of the Krell homeworld had left a scar that would not easily heal, a reminder to all that the line between survival and atrocity was dangerously thin. The Galactic Tribunal's verdict had been clear. Varis was a war criminal, but the circumstances of his actions were acknowledged with a grudging understanding. Humanity was allowed to continue its existence, but it was closely watched, its every move scrutinized by a galaxy that now saw it as a potential threat. On Earth, Varis was both reviled and revered. Some saw him as a savior, the man who had done what was necessary to ensure humanity's survival. Others saw him as a monster, a symbol of the darkness that lay within the human soul. Statues were erected in his honor, only to be torn down by those who could not reconcile the heroism with the horror. His name became a lesson in military academies, his strategies studied and dissected by those who sought to understand the fine line between defense and destruction. But as time passed, the story of Captain Selan Varis began to take on a different tone. His exile became a symbol, not just of punishment, but of the sacrifices made in the name of survival. The barren world where he lived out his final days was a place of pilgrimage for those who sought to understand the cost of war. They came not to glorify him, but to grapple with the moral questions his actions had raised. What would they have done in his place? How far would they go to protect their own? And at what point does the price of survival become too high? As Varis grew older, his thoughts turned increasingly inward. He had saved his people, but at what cost to his own soul? The galaxy might never forgive him, but he had come to realize that it was not their forgiveness he sought. It was his own. And so, he spent his final years searching for peace, for some sense of closure in the knowledge that his actions had shaped the future of humanity, for better or worse. In the end, Varis's death was a quiet affair, marked not by fanfare or ceremony, but by the stillness of the barren world that had become his home. The galaxy took note of his passing, but the response was muted. He had long since become a symbol, a name in the history books, his legacy one of both caution and resolve. Yet, even in death, Captain Selan Varis continued to cast a long shadow. His story was one of survival, of the terrible choices that must sometimes be made in the face of extinction. But it was also a story of the consequences of those choices, and the enduring question of whether the end can ever truly justify the means. As the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, the legacy of Captain Varis remained a powerful reminder to all who sought to navigate the treacherous waters of interstellar politics and warfare. His name became a touchstone for discussions on morality and survival, a symbol of the fine line between heroism and monstrosity. And though he had been exiled to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, his influence was felt in every decision made by those who followed in his footsteps. For in the end, the story of Captain Selan Varis was not just a tale of one man's actions, but a reflection of the choices that all sentient beings must face when confronted with the darkness within themselves. His life was a testament to the complexity of survival in a galaxy filled with dangers both seen and unseen, and a reminder that the greatest battles are often fought not in the stars, but in the hearts and minds of those who must live with the consequences.